Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Conversations about COVID plus more with my colleagues, Jonathan Jerry, Emily Shore from the McGill Office for Science and Society. I'm Joe Schwartz. I direct this office, although these days I don't know exactly what direction we should be going in with all the confusion that is out there with COVID. Anyway, very special guest today, Dr. Yoni Freedhoff, who's Associate Professor of Medicine, University of Ottawa, but he's a specialist in the treatment of obesity, and that is going to be one of the topics that we will discuss here today. So, Yoni, welcome to our broadcast.
Thanks, Joe. It's nice to be here.
Well, we're going to get down, of course, to talking about obesity, but we can't ignore the events of yesterday with President Trump coming out and saying that he knew a long time ago about the risks of COVID and that it was serious, and he was just trying to forestall the panic. So, Yoni, what's your take?
Well, I mean, of course, it seems impossible that he wouldn't have known, given he is amazingly the president of the United States. It's always difficult to wrap my head around that when you think about it, just because it is so shocking. However, he does have advisors who presumably are intelligent and thoughtful, people like Dr. Fauci in his corner who are giving him information. So not at all surprising that he knew. Although to me, it certainly seems surprising that Bob Woodward decided to wait until just shy of the publication of his book to release this information. Now, I've heard people online say that, well, it's because had he released it earlier, it would have endangered his access to the White House and he wouldn't have been able to have more interviews. I've seen some people also suggest that by holding back, maybe it'll have a bigger impact because it's going to impact the election rather than have an impact on mask use back in February or March. But having written a book, and Joe, you've written a gajillion books, I know that the first draft was done a while ago. The interviews were done a while ago. Why it needed to wait until now is confusing when, had it been released, maybe it would have changed some of the public health direction on the ground in the United States, and they wouldn't be at a staggering 200,000 deaths at this point.
All right. Jonathan, what do you think? Is it going to make a difference in any way?
In terms of Trump's re-election possibilities?
Yeah.
No, I think he's Teflon.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but I think he's Teflon.
Yeah. Well, I like to think of it more as being mud-coated. Even if you're coated with mud and you sling more mud at it, it doesn't stick.
It is a staggering thing that we are, all four of us here, unable to, with any certainty, predict whether or not he will or won't be reelected.
Totally.
I mean, that's an amazing thing, given how inept the government has been in the United States under his reign. And given sort of his approach to everything in life, the Teflon coating, it really is dramatic to the point where it's almost unbelievable. It is so hard to understand how it is not a foregone conclusion what's going to happen in a few months.
Yeah.
The only difference between now and 2016 is that we are going in uncertain. And before, we were treating it a little bit more like a joke.
I just finished listening to Hoax, the book by Stilter, about this unholy alliance between Trump and Fox. And it's staggering how he's managed to get a whole network behind him. And so I just finished that yesterday, and today I started listening to Michael Cohen's book. And boy, is he ever vicious against Trump? But he also admits that he himself did a lot of bad things. But anyway, it's all fascinating stuff. Anyway, Yoni, let's get down to your area of specialty, which is dealing with overweight. And of course, this is certainly connected to COVID, because there have been all kinds of claims about people who are overweight being more at risk for contracting the disease and what to do. And in England, they're now emphasizing weighing students. So bring us up to date on what, the connection between obesity and COVID.
So there's actually a number of different areas that are worthy of discussion, and I tried to break them down for us to chat about. The first is whether or not there is a risk and whether or not we can conclusively state that it's worthy of great concern, because certainly the media suggests it's worthy of great concern. Then we should talk about confounding variables and whether or not, what's the causality, what's the directionality of this risk, and is it a physiologic risk or something else? I also think that some of the concern we're seeing in society about this is more indicative of moral panic than it is of actual concerns. I mean, obesity has been something that everybody wants to moralize about and has for, decades. And so if we start at the risk piece, and I think it's worth mentioning too, it's still relatively early days for this disease. We really don't have conclusive data. But looking at the data for obesity and the risk of intubation or death from COVID, it would seem that, at extremes of BMIs, so BMI is a measure of bigness, it's not a measure of health, but if BMIs exceed 40, and that's about 3% of the population, we do see a pretty dramatic rise in risk. But for the majority of people with obesity, they'll be the people whose body mass indices are between 30 and 35. These are people with, on some paper chart, a suggestion that they've got 50, 60 pounds that perhaps they ought to lose. That's a whole different topic for a different discussion of whether we can use weight to measure health. The risk is pretty comparable to a whole host of other conditions: heart disease, pulmonary disease, kidney disease, cancer, dementia. Those all have similar risks to obesity as far as COVID goes. And obesity has far less risk than a whole bunch of things, which we hear a little bit about. We hear about age, of course. So over the age of 50, risk is very high, higher for sure than the risks with obesity. Being Black, being Asian, being of a low socioeconomic status. There was a report yesterday out of Ontario showing that immigrants and refugees were disproportionately suffering with COVID. And although those topics get mentioned, they're treated very differently. And, one of the most bizarre things that I think I've seen, although perhaps it's not surprising, is the pandemic profiteering around obesity built off of this data, where we're seeing actually physicians come out with diet books to suggest that following this diet will either help you lose this weight that puts you at massive risk for obesity or for COVID-19, or that you can prevent it. And I find it surprising, given that, again, it is a risk factor, but not more so than many other things, really only more so at very extreme weights. And yet we talk about it as if this is the biggest driver of COVID morbidity beyond just age. And I'm not sure if that's how you guys see it too, but certainly given what I do and I've got different lenses on, that's the way I read things in the media.
Beware of physicians writing diet books, right?
Well, I did write one, but yeah, no, I think it's a fair thing to state for sure. But, do you see that obesity gets a lot of attention in regard to COVID-19, or is that just because I see it all the time?
And frankly, I've never thought that deeply about it, because I just assumed, obesity is a risk factor for essentially everything. So why should it not be a risk factor for this? Right. One thing that I do hear from my daughter, who's an emergency physician, and she spends her life intubating patients, is that it's much more difficult to intubate an obese patient.
Yeah. So without doubt, there's challenges. And so that's where we get into the confounders, right? So definitely we know that obesity does associate with a whole host of different medical comorbidities. And so I don't know, I'm by no means a statistical expert. So looking at the studies and trying to determine whether they controlled properly for comorbidities is well beyond my pay scale. But I think when we're talking about obesity and comorbidities, it's not actually just the diseases we should be talking about. So there's a lot of differences in how people with obesity are treated. Sometimes, Joe, like you were saying, it's a consequence of literally just the size. And it's more difficult to do things like intubate with patients who have obesity, which you might imagine could have an impact on their outcomes. If There's more challenging intubations. If they take longer, that might be a risk factor for worse courses in the ICU. We know that with this disease, that proning, turning people on their stomachs, is something that people are doing therapeutically, and there's some belief that it does help in terms of patients in the ICU. I don't think it's a stretch to consider the possibility that people with obesity, proning might be a lot more difficult. Maybe it takes longer before they actually are proned as a consequence of the increased difficulty, or even simply needing more people. There may not be beds that are appropriately suited for people with obesity to be proned. And so we know that that can have an impact on care. We know people with obesity face a huge degree of weight bias and stigma from the medical profession. We know that, at least in regard to other diseases, people with obesity, they take longer to go see physicians, because of the stigma they've faced in the past, the blame that they felt. So could people with obesity be presenting further on into the disease to the point where that has an impact on their outcomes? Would they be admitted as quickly to hospitals or to ICUs? Did they get tested the same way? So, were people with obesity, did they receive testing, especially in the early days? Because a lot of the data we have on risk and obesity, the data we have is from the early days when testing was at a real premium. And it is not impossible to consider the possibility that because of implicit bias against people with obesity, that they weren't treated the same way. And there's actually precedent for that. So with H1N1, there were studies also that showed that people with obesity, they were much more likely to have more severe courses of H1N1. But when that data was reanalyzed and it was controlled for the administration of antivirals, it turned out that people with obesity received them later than people without obesity. And so there was a systematic bias in the management of people with obesity who also had H1N1. And could that be happening here? I definitely think it's possible.
Do you see any evidence of greater motivation to lose weight because of the fear of COVID and the fact that, the media is constantly telling us what the risk factors are, and obesity is always at the top of the list?
So certainly again, and maybe it really is my own sampling bias and my own confirmation biases getting in my way of being able to interpret what I'm seeing. But I do feel there's a lot more moral panic around obesity consequent to this. But whether or not that is actually transferring to individuals with obesity wanting to try harder, if there was, I guess the one thing people with obesity don't lack is any amount of, sort of fear, shame, blame, guilt, etc. That is something that people with obesity are told they should have constantly, right? And so this is just, one more drum beat. But, if the drums are playing loudly and you add one more drum, I'm not sure it makes a huge difference in terms of that message. So I think the message, you must lose weight because you're ill if you don't, is a hugely problematic message. I don't know if you guys saw the release of Canada's new obesity treatment guidelines, and I played a very small role in that document. But what's lovely to see is that we really are trying to go away from this notion that weight, scales, measure anything other than gravity, right? So scales do measure the gravitational pull of the earth at a given moment in time, but what scales don't measure is health, the presence or absence of health. There's plenty of people who are thin, who have major medical issues, and plenty of people who are fat who don't. It doesn't measure effort. It doesn't measure success. It doesn't measure lifestyle. And we are doing that a great deal. So I think that this idea that, that scales measure health is a very pervasive one. So I started this by talking about the new guidelines. The new guidelines finally are actually stating, well, no, so excess adipose tissue, excess adiposity, that's increased amounts of body fat. They should only be considered the chronic disease of obesity if they are actually causing problems and complications. No doubt at higher weights, there's a much higher chance of that being true, but it's not a given. And so this sort of idea that, you know, this panic, we need people with obesity to lose weight, otherwise COVID is going to be a huge problem. That's just part and parcel of the societal sort of tropes around obesity that we've seen for years and years and years and years. I mean, I'm not sure there's any topic in medicine that gets more airtime than obesity. As well, I'm not sure there's any topic in medicine where it is, something that is modifiable on the basis of how we use our forks and our feet, but so too are 80-85% of all chronic non-communicable diseases. But the only one we moralize about is this one.
Well, talking about modifiable, I know you've probably seen this paper from British Medical Journal, where they compared all of the different diets, and they looked at not only weight loss, but LDL, HDL, the blood pressure, etc. It's a monumental amount of work. I was very impressed with everything that they did here. It was basically a network meta-analysis, which is very difficult to do. I mean, it looked at all kinds of studies. But what is really interesting is the final conclusion. I mean, after really spending what I would think was a year putting this together, let me just take a second here to read the conclusion. Compared with usual diet, which I guess the average North American diet, moderate certainty evidence supports modest weight loss and substantial reductions in systolic and diastolic blood pressure for low carbohydrate diets like the Atkins and zone diet, low fat like the Ornish, and moderate macronutrient diet like the DASH or Mediterranean at 6 but not 12 months. No difference at 12 months. So their final conclusion is differences between diets are, however, generally trivial to small, implying that people can choose the diet they prefer from among many of the available diets without concern about the magnitude of benefits.
Yeah, so that's precisely the point that a friend of mine, Kevin Hall, and I were making a few years ago in the Lancet as well, that at the end of the day, adherence is king. So there really is no great evidence that there's a specific diet that is far better than other diets for weight loss for everyone. So one person's best diet is another person's worst diet. If you don't happen to like it, like even if there was data, even if you had a paper that said, you know, this diet is the best diet for weight management at 12 months, at 2 years, at 5 years. If you didn't like that diet, well, it's not the best one for you anymore, because you're not going to stick to something you don't enjoy when it's something as seminally important to us as food. Food's not just fuel. You know, it's comfort, it's celebration, it's social networking. You know, it has many roles beyond simply fuel. And so adherence is king. And, you know, another way to look at the paper, perhaps, and certainly I see this in my practice, and I've seen this in other papers where they've compared, usually it's just comparing low fat and low carb diets, but there are tremendous success stories from every diet. I mean, even the world's stupidest diets have incredible success stories. And so I think what's most important is that a person try a whole host of different things, see if they can find a pattern of eating that they enjoy, that in turn helps them with something. You know, that something might be weight loss, because certainly weight can impact a person's quality of life. It can impact medical conditions. It might be medical conditions, but all this to say, the most important question to ask oneself on any particular diet is, do I like this enough to keep living this way? And merely tolerating your diet is not likely going to give you great long-term outcomes.
What do you make of all the noise today about the intermittent fasting diets?
So I have some friends who absolutely have had success with intermittent fasting and ketogenic low-carb diets. And I'm not opposed to any of them.
And these are not obese people?
Sorry, I've seen people with obesity on these diets do well as well. So, you know, the bottom line, again, going back to what we're saying, is you need to enjoy it. Now, regarding my job as a physician, my job as a physician is to monitor the patient to ensure that they're staying healthy, that there's no problems or complications as a consequence of their diet. So certainly, for instance, on a ketogenic low-carb diet, I'm going to want to check to see what's happening with their lipid levels over time, because there's a percentage of people where they do rise substantially. That doesn't necessarily mean they should stop their diet, but it might mean discussing a statin. Monitoring nutrition. I have one gentleman who allows me to talk about him, so I'm not speaking out of turn. I think it's year 3 now. He is my only patient who is an intermittent fasting carnivore. He only eats meat. He has better lipid levels than I do. He takes a multivitamin because there are certain nutrients that you simply can't get on an all meat diet. He's very happy. He's maintaining a 100-pound weight loss. I don't recommend this to people as this is the one I think you should try, but I'm not going to stop him if he's medically safe and sound and happy. I think good for him. But all this to say, I think that it comes back to this idea that this is about choice and willpower. Yes, there will be people who successfully treat their weight or their other medical conditions through lifestyle change. But we forget the privilege involved in that, right? So this is permanent behavior change, intentional behavior change in the name of weight management or disease management. That takes a tremendous degree of privilege in terms of your own personal health and finances, caregiving requirements. Think of all the things that we all have done in the name of bettering something in our lives. Fitness, relationships, work, studies that we abandon because it's tough to make change. And yet we discuss this as if change is the thing that we need.
We are so biochemically different that you just can't predict things. I mean, I've always been confused by, the Atkins diet and the other high-fat diets with lipid levels. I mean, some people have spectacular lipid levels, even though they're eating what supposedly are all the wrong things.
That's right. So sometimes it's just the wiring, and it doesn't really matter what your lifestyle looks like. You're going to have issues. There's always going to be people who live incredibly on paper healthful lives who have dyslipidemias and hypertension and, diabetes, and the list goes on and on. But when we look at the world, so over the course of the past 60 years, roughly, in every single country, in every age category, in every sex and ethnic group, weight has gone up, despite huge differences in life experiences, attitudes, culture, etc. This is not an epidemic loss of willpower. If there were a message, an educational message, scare tactic, something that would have an impact, it would have had an impact somewhere already. And so when we look at all of those articles talking, for instance, about COVID-19 and obesity, what strikes me in terms of whether or not these are real concerns or just part of the moral panic, what strikes me is that if they were real concerns, we would see real solutions being discussed. So we'd be seeing medications, for instance. So there are actually some useful medications now for the treatment of obesity. Bariatric surgery is a remarkable treatment, proven over decades to extend life's quantity and improve life's quality. And I'm not a surgeon. It is a remarkable procedure, but I've not seen anything mentioned about that in these stories about obesity and COVID-19. We don't see messaging about the environment, marketing to kids, national school food programs, front of package label reforms, sugar sweetened beverage taxes and the revenues from that going elsewhere. There's many things that we could be doing to try to address this as an environmental problem. And again, I think that the fact that this has happened to every country on the planet for every age and ethnicity group speaks to the fact that we do need to address the environment, that this is not a disease of the individual. And if I'm going to read an article about COVID-19 and think, yeah, this is a really sincere thing, that these people are thinking about this matters, I'm going to want to see discussion beyond the individual. I'm going to want to see discussion about pharmacotherapy, and I'm going to want to see discussion about access to surgery as well. And we're not seeing that, which is remarkable to me.
I imagine it's at some point, or hopefully we will, right? Because it's still the very early stages of this, even though it feels like it's already been forever.
Well, so you're more hopeful than me.
I have to be hopeful for something.
I'm a pretty pessimistic man by nature. So to be fair, I should preface by saying that. But we are making improvements. So the fact that we're even having this discussion is an improvement. I think, 20 years ago when I started my career, discussion around anything beyond personal responsibility, it virtually never happened. Students in medical school, I'm old now, but the students in medical school these days, they are learning about implicit bias and obesity and weight bias. They are learning about treatment to a degree. I think there's huge amount of improvement that still needs to be made. But I don't think that the duration of this pandemic is going to see major sea change in this particular attitude. But the good news, I guess, if I'm being less pessimistic, is that I think the cruise ship is going in the right direction. I have to talk about cruise ships because we're talking about COVID. It's going in the right direction, but it's traveling very, very slowly. And hopefully we will see changes more over time. I think that this new guideline, for instance, from Canada, not that I expect it's going to change in-office treatment overnight, but it'll be used in teaching, it'll be used in policy formation. It will change the discussion to a degree, and over time, hopefully we'll see changes on the ground as well.
One thing I haven't seen so far yet, although there may be out there, is COVID diet. Although, I mean, there's
sadly it's out there, Joe.
And boost the immune system nonsense. Yes, that's, but I've not seen like a weight loss COVID diet.
I'm trying to, so I know that there have been courses. There was a prominent, and I won't name them, there's no need to name them, all the nutritional zealots are zealots, but this was a very prominent vegan guru who was putting on fairly early into the pandemic a COVID weight loss pandemic diet program online that cost a not insignificant amount of money to join. And I know just last week there was a cardiologist in the UK who came out with an immunity diet. There's no data at this point on diets to prevent or treat or manage COVID. As far as weight goes, again, we were saying before, there's nobody can claim that their diet is superior for everybody. It is a very wild, wild west out there when it comes to claims and approaches, and it's frustrating because people are getting duped all the time.
It's just another opportunity to profit. Like you said, pandemic profiteering. I like that term.
Yoni, let me ask you this. You've been in practice now 20 years or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Dealing with all of this stuff. What changes have you made in your own diet over that period?
So I've actually changed quite a lot. So I like to sort of describe the changes to diet as an evolution, right? You don't start off having great kitchen skills or tools or equipment or planning and prep abilities. You start slowly and you build. When I got married, my wife and I, we had a lot of boxed food in our freezer and we were not much in the way of cooking. I didn't exercise particularly frequently. And after she found out she was pregnant with our first child, we decided we should probably learn how to cook a bit. And it slowly evolved. And it's actually interesting. I was tweeting online with somebody earlier today about studies that look at your diet 15 years ago. And that is the anchor for the entirety of the outcome you're looking at is diet 15 years ago versus hypertension. In this particular case, it was hypertension. And clearly our diets change over 15 years. One of the other things that has changed in my case is that I can afford better Scotch than I could when I started my career. So that's nice too. But all this to say is that we do change our diets regularly. As far as in regard to obesity and preventing obesity, I can tell you that personally, what works for me is more frequent meals and snacks with an emphasis of protein at every single one, and pretty much full elimination, other than from Scotch, of calories from liquids. Drinking your calories is such an easy thing to not do. We almost never eat out, but that was just because of the way our lives are structured. And so that hasn't changed. And now I exercise between, I'd say, 4 and 6 times a week, which I started doing a decade ago when I turned 40, because I realized that I wanted to be functionally independent and not have other people wipe my parts for me, and that this was a good way to try to ensure against that over time. But it's weird to think that people believe that change is as simple as, I'll just make this one change and it's going to happen. It takes forever. If I tried to live with my current lifestyle, back in 2001 when I graduated, I'd have crashed and burned. There's no way I could do what I feel is normal now back then, because it took me a long time to learn, to get accustomed to it, to build it into my schedule. And I think people, they expect it's going to happen quickly and often for no particularly good reason. I know one of the things I'd said we should chat about, and I'll try to segue into it here, is in the UK, their National Obesity Forum, which is sort of their national official group, they have recommended that 4 and 5-year-olds and 10 and 11-year-olds get weighed when they return to class now, and then again in 6 months, in a bid to tackle COVID-related gains. And, there's no guidance on what to do if they've gained weight. It's not as if the kids or the parents don't know if they've gained weight. And certainly bullying, the number one source of schoolyard bullying is weight. And so all the kids are aware that this is an issue. All the parents are aware. But there's no plan. We don't do tests in medicine unless you've got something that you're going to do about it. And there's no extra guidance being provided because there is no known, uniformly reproducible, individual program to provide parents with to help. And I'm somebody who runs an interprofessional Ministry of Health funded program for parents of children with obesity. We do have this lengthy program, and we'll ask them to measure their kids before and after, but there's this huge intervention. Meanwhile, in the UK, there's no intervention whatsoever. And what amazed me the most, actually, of all of it is not that it existed. It was when very thoughtful people, one in particular, and again, I won't name them, they sent me a private message. They're in a different country, and they're saying, we need to measure, otherwise we'd be flying blind. And I'm like, well, but you're not doing anything. If there's no intervention, if you're measuring something already exists, let's measure all the speeders, but not ticket them. Let's not change the stop signs. Let's not do anything. We'll just measure. And I find this idea that measuring people, children especially, is going to be a help as a really staggering, surprising thing, considering that these are thoughtful people.
Is
this
the
is a good idea.
Problem in the UK essentially the same as in North America?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said, Joe.
Is the overweight problem in the UK the same as here?
Yeah, listen, pretty much. I mean, so everybody's the same trajectory. It's just people have different starting points. But I usually, for instance, say that Canada is roughly a decade away from the States as far as our trajectories go. But they're going up everywhere, and there's a problem, challenge everywhere. But again, I do feel that this is a challenge that needs to be addressed through engineering of the environment and change to our food culture more than any likelihood of
you think
tearing.
that the existence of COVID now, which means that people are baking more at home, ordering in fast food more, do you think we're going to see a rise in weight issues?
So I think that that'll be true for some and not true for others. So right now we don't know. So there is no data that can really conclusively state what's happening to the average person's weight. Working with my patients, I can tell you that some absolutely are finding exactly that baking, especially pandemic baking, which I've become a sourdough baker as well. Pandemic baking is leading to weight gain for some people, for sure. But I've had other patients where prior to COVID, they were eating out 4, 5, 6 times a week. And now they're virtually never eating out. And they've had this opportunity over time to learn how to cook. And they're doing that more. And as a consequence, they've actually found their weight loss to be easier, but it really varies. And again, I will bring it back to that discussion we were having earlier about the privilege involved, especially through COVID, the extra hardships that many families are experiencing, the uncertainty, the child care, the worrying about elders in long-term care that they haven't been able to see. It's a staggering amount of stress and pressure. And so even if there were a COVID-related weight gain, pointing it out without any plan or means to help, I'm not sure is doing anybody any favors. It's just adding to this pile of, shame, blame, guilt, and fear that we weren't lacking in beforehand.
Can I ask you?
Data-wise, is that restaurant owners are getting leaner in the wallet.
That's for sure. And I think that, I feel badly for the industries. I discourage people from eating out regularly as part of my job. I think we should have the smallest number of meals out that we need to like our lives. And that's sort of the way I approach any indulgence, whether it's eating out, sweets, savory food, Scotch, whatever. It's the smallest amount you need to be happily satisfied. But I do wonder about the choices that we are prioritizing in society. We're getting, I guess, a bit off topic, but it's surprising to me that we've prioritized bars before schools, indoor dining before schools, even places like gyms. But I appreciate that if I say those things and if things change, there's going to be people who suffer. It's a really, really vicious problem where there's no good solution. There's no good answers. There's no one way to do this that is going to spare everybody.
I know the bars, that's bizarre. And I really have trouble relating to that. I mean, you mentioned before better Scotch. I can't quite relate to that. Although I have 3 sons-in-law.
You have sons-in-law who can.
Who are experts in Scotch, and they're trying to teach me. And I've gotten to a point now where I can tell if it's smoked or not. but I'm still struggling to sip it.
But the fact that we opened the bars in August and expected the schools to open in September and that cases wouldn't rise beforehand, I mean, it just seems backwards. But again, I'm sure there are considerations that we're not privy to. But as a parent and as a physician, it's a strange thing, the way we've gone about opening or reopening and the way we've dealt with the schools and the kids. Here in Ontario, I received a note from my child's school board, or my children's school board, that there are no maximum class sizes for grades 4 and up. That's a mind-boggling statement in a pandemic time, especially when we know 30% of the population, the kids, have been opted out of in-person learning. But they've now collapsed all the class sizes because those are the contracts with the Ministry of Education and the schools. They need to have certain class sizes to adhere to their contracts. And the whole thing is very frustrating, and it's frustrating for everybody, but I suspect that some hard lessons will be learned and we will see further changes. And it still is the early days of this, and we'll see a lot of growth over time.
Let me just bring Jonathan in here for a minute, because Jonathan is as scientifically minded as anyone. So Jonathan, let me ask you the same question that I asked Yoni. In all your years of dealing with issues, food-oriented issues, what change have you made in your own diet?
Well, it's been a long journey, and I will echo what Yoni has said, is that it takes a while to sort of wrap your head around these things, and your values may also change. I mean, the way, I didn't value health the way that I do now when I was in my early 20s. And so that has made a difference. There have also been, health complications that have changed what I can and cannot eat. And there's the fact that I'm a picky eater as well. So my diet is still evolving. So yeah, it's still changing. And I suspect it will keep changing for the foreseeable future.
Well, Joe, you're not going to ask me?
The rabbit food girl.
I was just going to say, when I used to go to the office, Joe said I eat rabbit food every day. So ask me.
Yes.
How my diet has evolved over time?
Yes. Where did the rabbit food get?
It wasn't always rabbit food. And also, I do think it is a combination of eating, or of one's diet, and also physical activity. I do think they go hand in hand. I think, even though I do know that there are diets like, at the end of the day, it's like 80% what you put in your mouth, that you could still lose weight and everything. But I do think it is a matter of feeling well. And so, I do try and eat protein and veg at every meal, and lower on the carb scale, but it has changed a little bit in this pandemic also. And just being at home, but still being active. And, but it wasn't always like that. And a lot of it, like you said, Yoni, is a matter of, I think, privilege, or how one grew up. And I definitely see how that influences, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that we do overthink it as a general rule. I mean, at the end of the day, not drinking your calories is probably a really easy, straightforward idea. Minimizing your restaurants, making sure you're cooking more often from fresh whole ingredients, ideally, if you can afford to, but there's nothing wrong with frozen vegetables, that's for sure. We're making changes now as a consequence of one of my daughters who's decided she wants to be more vegetarian. So we're cooking more vegan foods than we ever used to. But, it's an ever evolving thing. But at the end of the day, people get so far into the weeds of trying to be perfect at eating a particular way that I think they end up quitting. I mean, to be fair, that's my bias. That's the whole thesis of the book I wrote, is that we try too hard and find some, middle ground that's less perfect that you can actually stick with, rather than trying some extreme effort that you can't stick to, because why would you? But God bless the people who like strict. I just think that that's not most of us, and that we should try to evolve and explore and change. And having kids, if the opportunity arises, I'll tell you, trying to teach them to cook. So my baby's now 11. My oldest is now driving. So that's the range of the 3 kids, but they all have to cook a night a week, and they can, which is really nice. My wife and I each only have to cook twice a week. It's fantastic. They make their own lunches. This is a great thing to teach your kids to cook. So I would strongly encourage that if people are listening, and if they don't know how to cook, if you don't know how to cook, then doing that together is a worthwhile endeavor as well. If you
I'll tell you a little anecdote. I don't eat smoked meat often, but I do like it. And of course, in Montreal, not to ever go to Schwartz's is just
it'd be a sin.
Exactly.
So anyway, they do have a takeout counter, actually a separate store right beside the restaurant, only takeout. So I go in there a couple of weeks ago to get some smoked meat, and this lady comes in and she looks at me, and of course I can tell right away that she recognizes. I can't believe you're here. How can I be eating smoked meat? When I supposedly know enough about science not to do it. So anyway, I decided to double by order, and I bought 2.
And I hope you got medium and a black cherry pop to go with it, right? Because that's how you're supposed to do it.
Absolutely.
But I get that too all the time, Joe. I remember one time I was at the Jewish Community Center for an event, and somebody came up to me and said, "I can't believe the Freedhoff girls are eating cupcakes." I'm like, "What do you think? Like,
right.
what do you think happens in our world? Like, it's." Right. This is just the way it is.
And that's the whole message.
All the things that I've dealt with, on Facebook and writings, etc., I can tell you that what gets the most response, if I ever address the issue of smoked meat, especially comparing it to the pastrami. New York versions of, pastrami, which is, of course, not smoked meat, but even that second place to the bagel issue. If I dare mention, that Montreal bagels are superior to New York bagels, which
they are.
They absolutely are. There's no question.
To us, this is not even. Yeah. We don't even question this.
No.
Right? But you should know the number of people who question this in the U.S.
Well, people are allowed to be wrong.
Right.
They are, and let's face it. In America, there's 40% of them who are as wrong as can be.
Yes, indeed. Right. Let's hope it's only 40%.
Right.
Yes,
right.
Yes. Unfortunately, that was enough to do it last time.
That's true.
So it may be enough to do it again.
We just came full circle.
Yes, we did. Yeah. Which means that it's time to wrap up. So thanks, Yoni, for being with us and for putting some sense into all of the nonsense that is out there about overweight. And I wish we had more answers about COVID and what to do, but we just don't. And this is one of the mysteries, and I've said this before, is that it's amazing relative to the amount of effort that has been put in to finding solutions and finding what to do. The payback has been so little. I mean, all we can do now is say yes, physical distancing, although exactly the distance is becoming more and more murky, right? I mean, the 6 foot seems to be disappearing because there's evidence of spread further than that.
Oh, so,
further than 6 feet, yes.
Oh my God, I thought I was a little happy there for a sec.
Oh yeah. There's some are talking 23 feet because of one particular.
23, very specific.
Indoors, yeah. And so, who knows where this is going to go, except that it is not going away quickly. We know that the heat does not take it away. There are no miracles, as Trump has said, So
there's a miracle if Trump will not win the election.
Yeah. Yoni, very quickly, how do you see this?
So I said before, I'm very pessimistic by nature, but I'll tell you, I'm optimistic for lower sensitivity, quick home testing, or, every kid before school does a saliva test and can't go to school if it's positive. If you go to a restaurant, you get a test, and so on and so forth. If we can get those tests up and running, and my understanding is they exist, but they're not quite fast enough yet. They're about 15 minutes rather than less than 5 minutes. I think that'll open things up. And I think the technology exists. We don't have to make sure that the vaccine works or doesn't work. And we don't have to worry about people not having uptake of getting tested. And so my hope is that quick rapid testing will evolve quickly, and maybe we'll even see it by springtime. And that will give us some semblance of normal again.
The Brits apparently have one, a 10-second test, and they're now testing it at airports.
Yeah.
So
I know Air Canada wanted to do something with public health, I think, here to try and do that as well.
I mean, these are solvable problems. I mean,
Yeah.
that, I mean, there's enough biochemical ingenuity out there that they will solve this problem of testing.
Yeah, and I think it'll be much more readily taken up than vaccines, with far less of a distribution problem too. So let's hope.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks a lot for being with us,
Yoni.
Yoni. And it's
Thank
lunchtime.
you.
It's lunchtime, so I'm yearning for a smoked meat.
Although I'm jealous.
Not on a bagel. That's not acceptable. Even on a Montreal bagel, no, you don't eat smoked meat on a bagel.
No.
Okay, so Yoni, we'll check back with you again in maybe a few months and see how we have evolved and whether or not there's any more information on the link between COVID and obesity.
Sounds good. Thanks, Joe.
So thanks a lot for being
Jonathan.
with us.
And thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Emily, our next session is when?
We're back in 2 weeks, September 24th, with Dr. Paul Offit, who's making a return to talk about vaccine situation.
And we have a symposium coming up.
October 19th and 26th. It's called In Whom Do We Trust, featuring Britt Hermes, a former naturopath, Brendan Nyhan, professor of government at Dartmouth, talking about fake news, Anthony Warner, who also Yoni knows well. He's a chef and a writer and food blog, and he'll be talking about food and production of food. And also Wendy Zuckerman, who's the host of Science Versus the podcast, talking about science journalism in the age of COVID. That's all on our website. Please register. Thank you.
Okay, and our website, of course, is mcgill.ca/OSS. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Bye.